September 19, 1944. Hill 246, Lorraine, France. First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper cannot see his own men. The fog is that thick. 4 machines idle behind him, each one carrying 5 soldiers, each one wrapped in armor barely thicker than a kitchen knife. 13 millimeters of steel. A heavy machine gun round can punch straight through it. These are M18 Hellcats, the fastest tanks in the entire war, and right now they are creeping forward at walking pace, blind, toward a ridge they have been ordered to hold against German armor that outweighs them nearly 3-1. The crews have heard what other soldiers call this vehicle: a death trap, a purple heart box, a toy. At 7:48 in the morning, a shape rises out of the white wall in front of Leiper. A gun barrel, then a turret, a Panther tank, 30 feet away, invisible until this exact second. In the next 5 minutes, one sergeant riding in the last Hellcat in that line will do something that has never been recorded before in American armored warfare. He is about to face 6 Panthers alone, with a gun that cannot beat them, and armor that cannot stop them. What he does next will decide whether he lives, and it will rewrite what anyone thought a machine this thin could survive. September 19, 1944. A ridge the maps called Hill 246, just south of a village called Rechicourt-la-Petite, in the Lorraine region of eastern France. It was 7:45 in the morning, and First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper could not see a thing. The fog had rolled in before dawn, and it had not lifted. It sat low over the fields, thick enough that the 4 machines behind him existed only as sound, engines idling, tracks creaking against wet earth. He could hear them, he could not see them. Each one weighed 17 tons. Each one carried a 76-millimeter gun. Each one was wrapped in armor so thin that a heavy machine gun round, fired close enough, could punch straight through the hull. 13 millimeters of steel, half an inch, less steel than the door panel of a truck, stood between these crews and a German shell. The turret above Leiper's head had no roof. 3 days of rain had been falling across Lorraine, and it dripped now onto his map case, onto the radio set at his knee, onto the brass shell casings rolling loose under his boots with every small movement of the vehicle. If a grenade landed in this turret, there was nothing between it and the 5 men inside. The air smelled of wet hay, diesel exhaust, and cold iron. Somewhere behind the fog, a cow lowed in a field that did not know a war was passing through it. Leiper's fingers had gone numb around the hatch rim an hour ago. Every man in the platoon was doing the same thing he was doing, straining to hear a change in engine pitch, a shout in German, anything that might tell them where the enemy actually was before the enemy told them by firing first. This was the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked vehicle built by any army in the entire war. 55 miles an hour on a paved road, faster than a Sherman, faster than the German Panther by nearly double, and right now, on a dirt ridge buried in fog, it was crawling forward at walking pace, toward a position it had been ordered to hold against German armor that outweighed it nearly 3-1. The men riding in these machines knew exactly what they were sitting inside. They had heard the names other soldiers called it. Some of the names came from infantrymen who had watched a Hellcat burn from a distance and never forgotten it. Some came from Sherman crews who had been offered a transfer to tank destroyers and refused. The names were not kind, but the one that stuck, the one the crews used about themselves, was the simplest. They called it a purple heart box. None of them argued with the name. They had watched training films that told them to use speed instead of steel, to shoot and then run before the enemy could answer. It was one thing to hear that in a briefing tent in England. It was another thing to sit in an open turret in a French field, feeling the rain find the back of your collar, knowing that the only thing standing between you and a shell was how fast your driver could find reverse gear. And somewhere ahead of them, moving through that same fog, invisible and closing, was the Panther. 45 tons of sloped armor, a gun so accurate at range that German crews called it a sniper rifle mounted on tracks. 80 millimeters of steel across the front plate. Leiper's own gun could not punch through that frontal armor. not at 1,000 yards, not at 500. The math simply did not work in his favor, and every man in his platoon knew it. At 7:48, Leiper saw it. A muzzle, a German tank gun, emerging out of the white wall of fog barely 30 feet away. What happens in the next 5 minutes will become one of the most extraordinary individual stretches of fighting in the history of American armored warfare. But to understand why it mattered, you have to go back further than this ridge. You have to understand what this machine actually was, what kind of men climbed into it, and how an army that outnumbered these 4 crews 8-1 came to be standing in this fog at all. The story starts 12 days earlier, 200 miles to the west, with the fastest army in Europe running out of gas. By early September 1944, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army had done something no Allied force had managed since the invasion began. It had covered nearly 400 miles in 9 weeks, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Moselle River here in Lorraine. Patton's lead formation, the 4th Armored Division, had pushed so far ahead of every other unit on the front that its own fuel trucks needed 2 full days just to make the round trip back to the nearest depot. Men who had crossed France in the summer heat, standing in open hatches while French villagers threw apples and bottles of wine up onto the hulls, now found themselves stopped cold on a ridge in Lorraine, with empty jerry cans stacked uselessly behind their vehicles. And then the gas ran out, not slowly, not in part. The Third Army's daily fuel allotment dropped from 400,000 gallons to 31,000. Barely enough to move a single division, let alone an entire army racing for the German border. The reason sat far to the north, where Allied High Command had chosen to funnel fuel toward Field Marshal Montgomery's push into Belgium and Holland, the effort that would soon become Operation Market Garden. Patton's tanks sat exactly where they stopped. The 4th Armored Division, which days earlier had been sprinting toward Germany, coasted to a halt in the rolling farmland around a market town called Aricourt. Colonel Bruce Clark, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored, set up a defensive line. He had Shermans. He had Stuart light tanks. He had 36 M18 Hellcats belonging to the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. He had artillery, and he had Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams leading the 37th Tank Battalion from the turret of his own Sherman, a tank he had named Thunderbolt. By September of 1944, Abrams was already on his 4th Thunderbolt. The previous 3 had all been shot out from under him over the past 3 months of fighting. Clark's men dug in. They set up roadblocks. They ran patrols out along the muddy lanes between the villages, and they waited. None of them knew yet what was coming toward them. What was coming had been assembled in a factory town in eastern Germany just 15 days earlier. Hold on to that number. 15 days. On September 4th, the German High Command activated the 113th Panzer Brigade under a colonel named von Seckendorf. On paper, it looked like a powerful formation. 42 brand-new Panther tanks, straight from the assembly line, some of them still wearing the grease applied for rail transport. 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers riding alongside. Enough vehicles to stretch over a mile down a single road. But paper is not a battlefield, and here is the detail that changes everything about what would happen at Aricourt. The men inside those Panthers had never fought together. Most of them had never fought at all. They had been pulled from replacement depots scattered across Germany, given a few days of rush training, loaded onto trains and shipped west. They had no reconnaissance troops scouting ahead of them, no engineers to clear obstacles, no artillery observers who had worked with these specific crews before. The brigade had been built to look like a closed fist. In practice, it was 42 fingers, each one pointing in a slightly different direction. Most of the young men riding inside those Panthers were younger than the war itself felt to them. Boys pulled off farms and out of factory towns, handed a crash course in gunnery, and told they would be fighting the army that had already broken the Wehrmacht's back in Normandy. Some of them had written letters home the night before boarding the trains, the kind of letters young soldiers write when they suspect, without saying it out loud, that they might not get another chance. The Americans facing them were the opposite. The men of the 4th Armored Division had been fighting together since Normandy. Tank crews had learned each other's instincts over 3 months of continuous combat. Radio operators recognized each other's voices without needing a name. Officers had been promoted not by seniority, but by the blunt fact of staying alive and competent long enough to lead. When Abrams gave an order to move, his company commanders did not ask where. They already knew. This is the imbalance no chart could capture. A chart would tell you the Panther outweighed a Hellcat by 28 tons, that its front armor was 6 times thicker, that its gun could kill at twice the range. All of that was true, but no chart could measure the distance between a crew that had bled together for 90 days and a crew that had met each other on a train platform 2 weeks before. On September 18th, the German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel launched its counteroffensive. The plan was simple on paper: smash through the 4th Armored Division, retake the Moselle crossings, and stop Patton's army before it ever reached German soil. Manteuffel had 2 fresh panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, along with the battered but experienced 11th Panzer Division behind them. Over 260 armored vehicles in total. Clark had roughly 160 tanks and 36 Hellcats to hold the line. And the forecast for the morning of September 19th called for dense fog across the entire Aricourt Plain. That fog was about to change everything, because fog takes away the one thing that makes a Panther dangerous, which is range, and it hands the advantage to the one thing a Hellcat does better than any armored vehicle built by either side in this war: speed. Which is exactly what was rolling toward Lieutenant Edwin Leiper's 4 Hellcats on Hill 246 at 7:48 in the morning, as a Panther's gun barrel slid out of the fog 30 feet in front of him, and the war on this ridge began. The muzzle hung in the fog for less than a second before Leiper's lead gunner reacted. Sergeant Stacy's Hellcat had rolled into position at the front of the small column, and it was his crew that saw the Panther first, a gray shape solidifying out of white nothing, close enough that there was no time to calculate range or angle. There was only time to fire. The gunner's first round struck the Panther low on the hull, near the drive sprocket, and the German tank lurched to a stop, smoke curling up from beneath its front plate. It did not explode. It simply stopped being a threat, engine dead, crew scrambling out into the wet grass. For a machine that outweighed Stacy's Hellcat by nearly 30 tons, it had taken one shot, fired from 30 yards, to end its part in this war. There was no time to feel anything about it. A second shape was already emerging from the same stretch of fog, following the same track the first Panther had used, close enough behind it that its own commander had not yet realized his lead tank was burning. Stacy's gunner traversed, found the new shape, and fired again. The second Panther jolted as the round found its mark, smoke pouring from its engine deck within seconds. 2 Panthers destroyed in under a minute, and Stacy's Hellcat had not moved 15 feet from where it started. The Germans answered. A third Panther, somewhere off to the side, put a round into Stacy's hull. The impact rocked the light vehicle hard enough to throw men against the gun breech, and when the smoke cleared inside the fighting compartment, 2 of Stacy's crew were bleeding, one from a gash across the scalp where a fragment of the interior spall liner had sheared away, the other from a shard of hot metal buried in his forearm. The gun itself had been knocked out of alignment, the sighting mechanism jarred loose by the force of the hit. Stacy did not have a working weapon anymore. What he had was a driver still capable of moving, and a decision to make in about 2 seconds. He gave the order to pull back. The driver threw the transmission into reverse, and the Hellcat's automatic gearbox, a piece of engineering most Sherman crews did not even have, responded instantly, no clutch to find, no gears to grind. The vehicle came off the ridge under its own power, engine screaming, and began the run back toward Aricourt, with 2 wounded men holding pressure on their own injuries in the back of an open turret filling slowly with rain. In the back of the fighting compartment, the loader pressed a field dressing hard against the arm of the wounded gunner, shouting over the engine noise for him to keep his hand raised, keep pressure on it, stay awake. Neither wounded man made a sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. There was no room in a moving Hellcat for anything more than that. The vehicle rocked over ruts in the farm track at a speed that would have been reckless on a paved road in peacetime, and still it felt too slow to every man inside it who understood exactly how thin the metal around them actually was. He would survive. Both wounded men would survive. But Stacy's fight was over before 8 o'clock in the morning, and 3 Hellcats remained on that ridge to face whatever else the fog was still hiding. One of those Hellcats found the Panther that had hit Stacy. It had not moved far, still repositioning after its own shot, and the Hellcat's gunner put a round into its flank before its own gun could finish traversing back around. A 4th kill in the first few minutes of contact. 2 more German tanks, somewhere in the murk below the ridge, tried to reverse their vehicles back toward the tree line, out of a fight that was clearly not developing the way their column had expected. It was the wrong decision. A Panther reversing exposes its rear deck and the thinner armor along its sides, the same armor that a 76mm round can punch through cleanly at close range. The Hellcats caught both tanks in the middle of their retreat and put shells into their sides before either German driver could complete the turn back into cover. 5 German tanks destroyed, 1 Hellcat damaged and withdrawn, its crew alive. Elapsed time, less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Hold that number next to another one. The 113th Panzer Brigade had spent 15 days assembling, fueling, and moving 42 Panthers across half of Germany and France to reach this stretch of road. In 5 minutes, 5 of them were burning in a field their crews had never seen before dawn that morning. But Leiper's fight was nowhere near finished. He had 3 Hellcats left, and from his position on the ridge, he could hear what the fog refused to show him. The low grinding of tracks, the rise and fall of engine noise, not 1 or 2 vehicles, a column, moving in volume along the road that connected Rechicourt to the fields beyond it. How many tanks made up that column, Leiper had no way of knowing. The fog gave him sound. It gave him nothing else. Every instinct built into a man commanding 3 thin-skinned vehicles with 13 millimeters of armor said the same thing. Pull back. Get behind the ridgeline. Get out of the path of whatever was coming. Live to fight from better ground another day. It was the sane decision. It was probably the decision most officers in his position would have made, and no one would have questioned it afterward. Leiper keyed his radio and got fragments back, other voices on the company net asking for his position, asking what he had run into, asking whether the road toward Rechicourt was still open. He did not have good answers for any of it. He had 5 burning Panthers behind him, 1 wounded crew heading back toward Aricourt, and a sound coming out of the fog ahead of him that he could not yet put a number to. Leiper did not give the order to withdraw. He moved his 3 remaining Hellcats a short distance to a neighboring rise, a piece of high ground with a slight depression running along its face, low enough that the vehicles could tuck their hulls down into the earth itself and present as small a target as 3 17-ton machines could manage. Crews checked their remaining ammunition racks in silence, counting rounds the way men count things when they suspect they may need every last one of them. Then he told his crews to hold their position and wait. What came out of that fog over the following 20 minutes would ask more of these crews than anything they had faced since landing in France, and it would end with 1 sergeant, alone in the last operational Hellcat on that hillside, doing something that no training manual had ever described. The column came into range the way everything came in this fog, suddenly and without warning. Leiper, straining from the depression, caught the outline of turrets moving along the road below, dark shapes sliding past gaps in the mist. In open country, on a clear day, that column would have spotted 3 Hellcats sitting on a rise from 1,000 yards out, and at that range the outcome would not have been in doubt. A Panther's gun at 1,000 yards was a death sentence for anything with 13 millimeters of armor standing in front of it. But this was not a clear day. The fog had compressed the entire battlefield down to 100 yards, sometimes less, and at 100 yards the rules that governed tank warfare simply stopped applying. At 100 yards, a Panther could not use the one advantage that made it dangerous. Its crew could not identify a target, judge the range, and put a round on it before something faster reacted first. At 100 yards, this was no longer an artillery duel between two different classes of weapon. It had become a knife fight, and in a knife fight, the size of the blade matters less than the hand holding it. The three Hellcats opened fire together, catching the column from an angle the Germans had not anticipated. Rounds that would have bounced harmlessly off a Panther's sloped front plate instead found the thinner steel along the turret sides and the hull, 45 millimeters here, 40 there, armor thin enough for a 76 millimeter shell to punch straight through and keep going. The lead tanks in the column stopped where they were hit. Some tried to swing their turrets toward the muzzle flashes on the ridge. Others tried to reverse blindly into fog they could not see through any better than the Americans could. Radio chatter inside those German tanks must have been chaos. Commanders shouting contact reports that made no sense. Gunners searching for targets they could hear but not see. Drivers waiting for instructions that were not coming fast enough. A column built to move and fight as one unit had been reduced, in the space of a few minutes, to a scattering of individual crews fighting alone, each one guessing at what was actually happening around them. The Germans hit back, and this time the fog worked against the Americans as much as it had worked for them. A round found one of Leiper's three remaining Hellcats and killed it outright, the crew compartment absorbing a hit that an open-topped, thin-skinned vehicle had no way of surviving. There was no warning to it, no sound that separated itself from the general roar of the fight until the impact itself arrived. Then a second round found another Hellcat a short distance away, and that crew fared only slightly better, the vehicle catching fire slowly enough that the four men inside had seconds, not minutes, to get clear before the ammunition stored inside began to cook off. Two more M18s gone in the space of a few minutes. Crews who had survived the first 5 minutes of this fight, now bailing out into wet grass they could barely see, some of them wounded, all of them moving on foot toward whatever friendly lines they could find, in a fog that made every direction look the same. One man crawled the first 30 yards on his hands and knees, rather than risk standing up into a line of fire he could not see. Another simply ran, guided by nothing more than the vague sense that the American rear lay somewhere behind him. None of them knew in that moment whether the platoon they were leaving behind still existed as a fighting force, or whether they were the lucky ones and everyone left on the ridge was already dead. That left one. Sergeant Henry R. Hartman's Hellcat was still in the depression, still loaded, still firing. What Hartman did over the next several minutes is difficult to reconstruct with total precision, because the same fog that had kept him alive also swallowed most of the details that would otherwise have been written down by someone watching from a safe distance. What survives in the unit's own after-action reporting is the result, and the result is almost impossible to believe on its own merits. From a single M18, 17 tons, 13 millimeters of hull armor, an open turret now half filled with rainwater, Hartman's crew destroyed 6 German tanks. Most of them were Panthers. Consider what a claim like that actually requires, mechanically, from 4 men working inside a machine this exposed. Every shot means breaking cover, even briefly, because the gun has to have a line of sight to fire. Every shot means the muzzle flash from a 76 millimeter cannon marks the Hellcat's exact position in the fog as clearly as a flare fired into a dark sky. Every shot means that every surviving Panther crew within earshot now has a rough bearing on where the fire is coming from, and is turning a 50-ton gun turret in that direction. After every shot, the driver has to move, immediately, blind, trusting a fog he cannot see through and ground he has not scouted. Find new cover. Stop. Give the gunner just enough time to find a target again. Fire, and move once more. All of it in a vehicle with no roof over their heads, armor that stops nothing heavier than a rifle round, and a transmission that groaned in protest every time it was pushed past 40 miles an hour. 6 times, according to the record left behind, Hartman's crew did exactly this. The first kill came quickly, a Panther still oriented toward where the earlier volley had come from, its turret facing the wrong direction entirely. The second took longer, Hartman's driver working the Hellcat backward through a stretch of soft ground that nearly bogged the vehicle down to its belly, the engine screaming under the strain, before the tracks finally bit and pulled them clear. The third and fourth came almost together, two Panthers that had drifted close to each other in the fog, close enough that a single well-placed round on the first gave the gunner just enough time to shift aim and catch the second, before its crew fully understood what was happening to the tank beside them. The fifth kill nearly ended the fight the other way. A Panther rotated its turret faster than Hartman's driver expected, and the German round passed close enough to the Hellcat's hull that the entire crew felt the shockwave of its passing before it buried itself in the earth somewhere behind them. There was no time to react to how close it had come. The gunner fired, the round found the seam it was looking for, and the Panther went still. The sixth kill came from a Panther trying to reverse out of the fight entirely, its commander apparently having decided, correctly, that whatever was happening on this stretch of road was not survivable. It did not reverse fast enough. 6 times they fired, relocated within seconds, and fired again before the surviving Panthers could settle a gun on the spot they had just left. 6 times the arithmetic that said a Panther should win any single engagement against a Hellcat without much difficulty was overturned, not by luck alone, but by fog, by speed, and by a crew that had been drilled to do one specific thing until it no longer required conscious thought. Find the place where the enemy's armor is thinnest, put a round there, and be gone before the enemy's turret finishes swinging around to answer. By the fourth kill, the loader's hands were shaking badly enough that he had to steady the next shell against his own chest before feeding it into the breech. Nobody in that turret said a word about it. There was no time, and there was nothing useful to say. The driver, soaked through, jaw clenched hard enough to ache, kept finding gaps in the ground that should not have been visible in this fog, reading the terrain by memory and instinct because his eyes were giving him almost nothing to work with. Hellcat crews across the 704th had learned something about the Panther that no German manual would ever have advertised to its own soldiers. Along the front of the tank, where the rounded bottom of the gun mantlet met the flat-angled glacis plate below it, there was a narrow seam, barely wide enough to matter on paper. A shell striking that seam at the right angle did not glance off the way it would, off the sloped armor surrounding it. It deflected downward instead, punched through a much thinner strip of roof armor above the driver's position, and detonated inside the crew compartment. It was not a shot a man could make from 500 yards under pressure. It was not a shot most gunners would ever get the chance to attempt in an entire war. But at close range, in fog, from a vehicle fast enough to actually get into position for it, that narrow seam turned the Panther's greatest asset, its heavy sloped armor, into the one place a Hellcat gunner wanted to aim. When the firing along that stretch of road finally slowed, 15 German tanks lay destroyed across the fields, and the roadway between Rechicourt and the Ridge Leapers platoon had been ordered to hold. 15 Panthers. Roughly 675 tons of German armor, reduced to burning hulks and abandoned wrecks, destroyed by 4 Hellcats that together weighed barely 68 tons combined. 3 of those 4 Hellcats were gone by the end of it, their crews walking back toward American lines through fog that had not thinned even slightly, some of them wounded, all of them alive. Hartman's Hellcat was still running. The engine idled roughly, overheated from nearly half an hour of hard reversing and sudden stops, and the barrel of the gun steamed faintly where rain met hot metal. Nobody in that turret spoke right away. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a fight like this one. Not relief exactly, closer to disbelief, the 4 of them looking at each other as if checking that the other 3 were actually still there. Word of what had happened on that ridge did not travel quickly. The rest of Combat Command A was fighting its own scattered engagements across a front that stretched for miles, and nobody at battalion headquarters yet had a clear picture of what 4 Hellcats and 16 men had just done to a third of a brand new German Panzer brigade. That picture would only come together hours later, once runners and radio reports began piecing together how many burning tanks lay across this one stretch of farmland, and even then, some of the men who compiled those reports found the numbers hard to accept at first reading. The battalion's own men would spend years afterward trying to explain what had actually happened on that ridge, and most of the explanations came back to the same short list. The fog had erased the Panthers' range advantage and handed the fight to whichever side could move and shoot faster inside 100 yards. The crews of the 704th had trained for exactly that kind of fight, drilling shoot and scoot tactics long before anyone expected to use them against a full column of brand new German armor. And the men driving those Panthers, brave as they clearly were, given that they kept trying to fight even as their column came apart around them, had never done this before. Not together, not as a unit, not against an enemy that had spent 3 months learning how to survive inside a machine built to punish the smallest mistake. It was not over. Leiper still had one operational Hellcat on that hillside, a battalion of exhausted crews scattered across the ridge on foot, and somewhere beyond the fog, more of the 113th Panzer Brigade's 42 tanks were still moving, still looking for a way through the line that Combat Command A had drawn across this stretch of Lorraine. Somewhere behind them, wounded men from Stacy's crew and the 2 lost Hellcats were still making their way toward aid stations that did not yet know how many casualties to expect. The morning was not finished, and neither was the fog. But something had already happened on Hill 246 that would take the rest of the war to fully explain. A machine that German tankers looked at and laughed had just taken apart a third of an entire Panzer brigade before most of Colonel Clark's other units even knew the attack had started. What the fog was hiding now, on the far side of that ridge, was whether the rest of Combat Command A could finish what 4 Hellcats had started, and whether the sky above Aracourt would clear in time to matter. For now, all that Leiper and Hartmann could do was wait together in that shallow depression, count the rounds they had left, and listen carefully and quietly for whatever very next sound the fog decided to carry toward them. By mid-morning, the fog began to break apart. Pale sunlight fell across the Lorraine fields for the first time in 3 days, drifting through gaps in the mist that widened by the minute. For the men who had spent the last several hours fighting an enemy they could barely see, the change should have felt like relief. For the Germans still moving through that same ground, it was the opposite. It was the moment everything turned against them. 2 things happened almost at once, and the 113th Panzer Brigade had no answer for either of them. The first was artillery. The 4th Armored Division's field artillery battalions had spent the entire morning tracking the sound of German engines through the fog, plotting rough positions, calculating fire missions on targets they could hear but not yet see. When visibility finally opened to 500 yards, forward observers could see exactly what they had been listening to for hours. They called for fire immediately. Within minutes, 105mm shells were falling on German armor caught in the open between Rechicourt and the fields beyond it. Tanks that had survived the close-range fighting on the ridge, now exposed on flat ground with nowhere to hide from artillery they could not shoot back at. Panther crews trained to fight tank against tank had no doctrine for what to do when the sky itself turned hostile. The second was air power. The same fog that had grounded American aircraft all morning broke apart just long enough for the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command to get into the sky. They came in low along the ridge lines, rockets slung beneath their wings, and found exactly what every fighter-bomber pilot hopes to find: a column of enemy armor sitting in the open on a road with no cover overhead and nothing to shoot back with. A Panther's 80mm of frontal armor meant nothing against a 5-inch rocket striking down into the thin engine deck from above. And then Abrams moved. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams had spent the morning positioning his 37th Tank Battalion along the ridgelines south of the fighting, waiting for exactly this moment. When the fog thinned enough to see, he watched Panthers pulling back from the direction of Leiper's Ridge, some of them trailing smoke, many of them turning their rear armor toward his position without realizing it. He did not wait for orders from above. He gave his own. A combined force from two of his companies wheeled south through Rechicourt, caught the retreating German column along its flank, and destroyed 9 Panthers in a running fight that cost 3 Sherman tanks in return. A short distance away, Captain Lamison, commanding a company of Abrams' battalion, pushed 4 tanks nearly 2 miles to a ridge west of the fighting and set an ambush. 8 Panthers drove directly into it, one after another, never realizing the position was occupied until the first shells were already landing among them. Lamison's crews had been dug into that ridge for barely 3 minutes before the German column arrived. 3 minutes. That narrow a margin was the difference between an ambush and a chance meeting engagement that could have gone either way. None of this happened because a colonel somewhere had drawn up a detailed plan for it. It happened because American tank officers, down to the level of individual company commanders, had the authority and the trained instinct to act without waiting for permission from 3 levels up the chain of command. Clark never told Abrams which road to take that morning. Abrams never told Lamison which ridge to occupy. Each man understood what needed to happen across the battlefield as a whole, and each one found his own way to make it happen, trusting that the rest of the force would move in support without being told. The 113th Panzer Brigade had no equivalent system, and it showed in everything that happened to it that day. Its crews had fought bravely. That much was never in question, not by the Americans who fought them, and not by the historians who studied the battle afterward. But they had attacked in scattered groups, without reconnaissance, without knowing what waited on the far side of the next ridge, and without any real way to coordinate once the fighting began. Each company-sized thrust ran into an American force that was already dug in, already talking to each other over the radio, already shifting reserves to meet exactly this kind of attack. The brigade did not fight one battle on September 19th. It fought a dozen small, disconnected battles, and it lost every one of them. By the end of that single day, the toll was almost impossible to reconcile with how the morning had begun. 39 German tanks destroyed. 4 American Hellcats lost. It was not a close ratio. It was not in the same universe as close. And September 19th was only the first day. Over the 10 days that followed, the German 5th Panzer Army threw the 11th Panzer Division and the surviving remnants of both Panzer Brigades against Clark's Combat Command A again and again, and each attack followed roughly the same pattern that had played out on Hill 246. A German thrust forward, an American response, artillery falling from a clearing sky, aircraft overhead when the weather allowed it, and a retreat that cost more tanks than the attack itself had gained ground. By September 29th, when the fighting around Aricourt finally quieted, the Germans had lost more than 200 tanks and assault guns out of the 260 they had committed to the offensive. The 113th Panzer Brigade, 42 factory-fresh Panthers that had not existed as a fighting unit 2 weeks earlier, had ceased to exist as one again, this time for good. But a single battle, however lopsided, cannot answer the larger question this story raises. If the Hellcats' performance on that ridge came down only to fog and fortunate positioning, the record afterward should show one remarkable morning followed by a long trail of losses. It does not. Across the entire war, the M18 Hellcat destroyed 526 confirmed enemy tanks and armored vehicles. 498 of those kills came in Europe, 17 in Italy, 11 in the Pacific. 220 Hellcats were lost to every cause combined, not only enemy tank fire, but mines, artillery, anti-tank guns, and mechanical breakdown. A kill-to-loss ratio of better than 2-to-1. The best combat record of any armored vehicle the United States fielded in the entire war. Not the Sherman, not the M10, not even the M36 Jackson with its heavier gun. The thinnest-skinned, most exposed vehicle in the American arsenal came home with the best record in it. 3 months after Aricourt, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the same story repeated itself. On December 19, 1944, At a crossroads village called Noville in Belgium, 4 Hellcats of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion were attached to a small task force defending against the 2nd Panzer Division during what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The fog was back. The cold was worse than anything these crews had experienced in Lorraine, cold enough to freeze the oil inside a gun's breech mechanism. The Hellcat crews fought from open turrets in temperatures that turned exposed skin numb within minutes, and by the time the fighting at Noville ended, they had destroyed a striking number of German tanks, by some accounts more than 20, using the same method Hartmann had used outside Rechicourt. Fire, reverse, disappear, reappear somewhere else on the field. German officers who survived Noville reported afterward that they believed they had been facing a much larger American force than actually existed. They had not been fooled by camouflage or deception. They had been fooled by speed. Here is the part worth sitting with, the part that Hellcat crews all seemed to agree on long before anyone wrote it into an official history. The machine did not forgive mistakes. A wrong decision in a Sherman might cost you a track. A wrong decision in a Hellcat cost you 5 men, and every crew that climbed into one of these vehicles understood that trade from the very first day of training. Looking back across the entire arc of the war, that unforgiving nature turns out to be the answer to the question these numbers raise. A vehicle that punishes the smallest error creates crews that stop making them, not through some abstract military theory, but through the blunt arithmetic of who survives long enough to keep fighting. The men who were still alive by the time of the Bulge had been filtered through months of combat inside a machine that killed the careless and the unlucky in equal measure. The ones left standing were not ordinary tank crews. They were the fastest, most disciplined men the armored force had, because nearly everyone slower had already been lost. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams went on to lead the armored spearhead that broke through to Bastogne that December, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne Division in what General Patton would later call one of the finest feats of arms in the entire war. He survived 7 tanks named Thunderbolt, shot out from under him, across 10 months of continuous combat, rose eventually to 4-star general, and served as Army Chief of Staff during the Vietnam War. When the United States designed the tank meant to replace every Sherman descendant still in service, it carried his name, the M1 Abrams. Colonel Bruce Clark, who had sent 4 thin-skinned Hellcats up onto a fog-bound ridge without knowing what waited for them on the other side, also retired a 4-star general. In later years, he said that Aricourt had proven something he already believed before that morning, that the quality of a crew mattered more, in the end, than the quality of the machine carrying them. Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann climbed down out of his Hellcat sometime before noon on September 19th and stood on Hill 246 in the last of the rain, looking out at 15 wrecked tanks scattered across ground his platoon had held for less than an hour. His own vehicle had taken nothing heavier than small arms fire all morning, not because 13 millimeters of steel had stopped anything meant to kill him, but because the men inside that thin hull had never stayed in one place long enough for a German gun to find them twice. The Germans had mocked this machine because they measured it the way soldiers measure everything, by the thickness of its armor and the size of its gun. By that standard, the M18 Hellcat was exactly what they said it was, a toy, a death trap with no business sharing a battlefield with a Panther or a Tiger. And by that standard, they were not wrong. What they had missed was the only number that ended up mattering. 526 kills against 220 losses, built 1 2-second bet at a time, by men who never had thick armor to hide behind and never needed it.